Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today we're plunging into a really thought-provoking perspective on the global financial landscape. We've got this fascinating article, State of Bitcoin, Global Monetary War, Central Bank Chaos, and the Strategic Role of Bitcoin, which features a discussion with Tom Luongo.
Yeah, it's definitely a deep dive that challenges quite a few of the narratives we hear pretty much daily. Our mission for you today really is to unpack this idea that what we might be seeing in global finance isn't just, economics as usual, but maybe, as Lingo puts it, a full-blown monetary war.
That's right. We're going to explore how central banks, specifically the U.S. Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank, might actually be locked in a struggle, and not just over interest rates, but something bigger, economic sovereignty, geopolitical leverage. We'll look at some, frankly, surprising claims about Europe's economy, the dynamic between certain political figures, and, where Bitcoin might fit into all this. Let's unpack it. Okay, kicking things off, the core premise Luongo lays out is, well, that this global monetary war is happening right now, involving the heavy hitters like the ECB and the Fed. He's saying this fight isn't just about tweaking interest rates, it's more fundamental. Economic sovereignty, geopolitical power plays.
Exactly. It's about who controls the global financial system, essentially.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Luongo suggests the Fed is keeping rates high, not just for domestic inflation, but to enforce discipline on the global dollar system. What exactly does he mean by enforce discipline there?
Well, in his view, enforcing discipline means kind of keeping other countries and their central banks in line, making sure the US dollar stays dominant. And the fascinating counterpoint is how he sees the ECB's recent rate cuts. Not strength, he says. He calls it a desperation move just to try and save Europe's economy.
Wow. That really flips the script, doesn't it? Usually rate cuts are presented differently.
Absolutely. It challenges that common perception that, cutting rates is always proactive or a sign things are okay.
So if the ECB's moves are desperate, in Luongo's view, how does he explain the mechanics? Like, what's happening behind the scenes with Christine Lagarde and the ECB's balance sheets?
Right. He argues Lagarde is basically forced to cut rates. Why? To plug balance sheet holes, which, basically means dealing with a serious shortage of ready cash liquidity within European commercial banks. And those holes, he claims, were created by the Fed's previous rate hikes. So European banks are under pressure losses, low liquidity, puts the ECB in a tight spot.
Okay, I see. And what about the Fed then? If Europe's playing defense, what's Luongo's take on Jerome Powell's strategy? Is it just reacting, or is there more to it?
Luongo presents the Fed's strategy as very deliberate, intentional. He thinks Powell is keeping rates high specifically to maintain U.S. dominance in global finance. The argument is the Fed can't really cut rates unless there's a, quote, sincere domestic crisis. And this high rate strategy, it forces other central banks into untenable positions. That's his framing.
You even have that quote, right? The way to enforce discipline.
Yeah, the way to enforce discipline on the global dollar market is to keep rates as high as possible for as long as possible. Pretty direct.
This perspective really paints a, well, bleak picture of Europe. Luongo doesn't hold back. He's claimed the continent isn't an attractive trade partner anymore. Germany's economy might be worse than before 2008. And he criticizes the media, too, says they avoid these inconvenient truths, focusing on trivialities or external conflicts.
Yes, exactly. And it raises a key question, doesn't it? If his view is right, why is the ECB portrayed as just reactive, like just trying to survive, not really competing? He draws a direct line from Europe's deflation and weak consumer markets straight back to what he calls dollar liquidity restrictions, basically, the fallout from the Fed tightening its policy, a stark cause and effect argument.
Okay, now if the central bank stuff was surprising, Luongo takes this into politics with something maybe even more provocative. He claims the friction we see between Trump and Powell is mostly political theater. He uses the word kayfabe.
Right, kayfabe, like in wrestling where the rivalry is staged for the audience. His evidence, or what he points to, is an anecdote about a supposed 2-hour secret meeting between them. After that meeting, Trump apparently went unusually silent on Powell, which Luongo interprets as suggesting some kind of strategic alignment.
Strategic alignment? What kind of alignment?
Well, Luongo argues it involves Trump pushing for long-term fiscal stability. He mentions something called the Big Beautiful Bill, which sounds like Trump's vision for a massive government financial cleanup dealing with debt.
Huh. And it's not just Trump and Powell. He takes aim at some libertarians, too, like Rand Paul and Elon Musk.
Yeah, a sharp critique there. He basically accuses them of missing the bigger picture, says they're focused on flawed budget projections and don't grasp the, quote, strategic need to stabilize the government's financial position before the 2026 midterms. He thinks stabilizing the government's books is paramount.
Okay, so we've got central banks, internal U.S. politics,
Hmm.
but Luongo argues this all spills over globally, right? These monetary wars have geopolitical consequences. Let's start with that claim about Ukraine's debt and the Bank of England. What does he say happened there?
Right. He highlights this claim that Ukraine defaulted on debt backed by the British government. And he says this was a massive event that the mainstream media just, well, ignored. And right after that alleged default, the Bank of England did this huge $83 billion overnight repo
A
injection.
repo injection, basically emergency cash for the system.
Exactly. An emergency loan to boost liquidity. Luongo connects that huge sudden injection directly to the fallout from the supposed Ukrainian default.
That does sound significant if it went under the radar like he claims. And sticking with the global view, he has that really unique take on Trump's tariffs. Not isolationism, but
Net access charges, yeah. Like ATM fees is the analogy he uses. You want access to the big U.S. consumer market, you pay the fee via tariffs. And what's really pointed is his claim that the real target wasn't China,
not China. Who then?
the European Union, according to Luongo. He accuses the EU of basically freeloading, profiting from U.S. markets and security without contributing fairly.
So the tariffs were a strategic weapon in this monetary war
Yeah.
against Europe, in his view. And he extends this idea of strategic manipulation, accusing certain global groups of messing with U.S. debt markets.
Yeah, he talks about Davos-linked entities, a shorthand for globalist institutions often associated with the World Economic Forum. He specifically mentions the IMF and EU bureaucracies. The accusation is they're manipulating the U.S. yield curve, trying to force the U.S. into bad debt practices that would cause problems down the road for future administrations.
Even though Trump supposedly wanted lower long-term rates to refinance U.S. debt.
Right. Trump might want that, Luongo says, but the market, possibly influenced by these external players, just won't comply. It's a complex picture of financial maneuvering.
Okay, so given this whole backdrop, this landscape of monetary war, central bank chess, political theater, geopolitical pressure,
Yeah.
where does Bitcoin fit in? The article title highlights it.
Yeah, it's positioned interestingly. He sees Bitcoin as a kind of potential release valve for what he calls collapsing fiat systems. It could play a few roles, he thinks. One, a neutral store of value if currencies are being debased. Two, potentially a stablecoin backer in future decentralized finance or DeFi systems. And three, maybe even a strategic fallback option if the dollar's dominance really starts to fade.
So not just speculation, but a potential strategic asset in this shifting world order he describes.
Yeah, that seems to be his core argument for Bitcoin's relevance here, yes.
So if we try to tie all these threads together,
Mm-hmm.
what are the main philosophical currents running underneath Luongo's whole analysis? What's the basic worldview?
Well, there are definitely some strong themes. A deep, deep skepticism of mainstream narratives is one, particularly media narratives. There's a very clear anti-globalism streak, critical of Davos, the EU, any kind of centralized economic planning, really. He seems to strongly support sovereign monetary policy, nations controlling their own financial destiny, even if it involves some short-term pain. And ultimately, it's all underpinned by this belief that a major reordering of global finance is not only inevitable, but actually underway right now.
Wow, what a dive indeed. This article, Luongo's perspective, it really pushes you to look beyond the day-to-day headlines, doesn't it? To consider these deeper, maybe hidden structural shifts happening with central banks and government.
It really does. It suggests we could be, on the edge of a really fundamental change in how the world deals with money, power, sovereignty. And the implications for you listening, whether you're deep into tracking global markets or just kind of curious about the forces shaping our economic future, they're pretty significant.
Absolutely. What a fascinating, if somewhat unsettling, reinterpretation of global events. So as you go about your day, maybe here's a final thought to chew on. If this idea of a global monetary war has merit, if traditional powers are grappling for control in these complex ways, what role will decentralized technologies like Bitcoin truly play in the years ahead, beyond just the price charts and the hype? Something to think about, right?
Always something new to think about. Keep digging, keep questioning, and join us next time for another deep dive.